I'm a wanderer.
Okay.
Can I wander?
You can. They'll follow you. So
Okay.
the camera's actually up there, and they have someone manning it. So
Okay. All right, good. I'm a wanderer.
Okay, welcome everybody. We have another Friday seminar for you, and this week we have Dr. Lisa Aultman-Hall, who is a professor of civil engineering at the University of Vermont. And she is also the founding director of the University Transportation Research Center there. And she's joining us today from UC Davis, where she's been on sabbatical doing research there on travel behavior, bicycling, and a variety of other topics. So today she's going to talk about this buzzword that we all use, particularly around here at OTREC with livability. So she's going to explore that a little bit more. So,
thank you. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the whole PSU team for inviting me and hosting me. And it's a great last trip on a West Coast sabbatical. I'd never lived on the West Coast, so I've really enjoyed traveling around. I sort of have two objectives today. I do want to talk about livability, but I want us to focus specifically on the rise and fall of that hype from 2009 and 2011. Livability has been around a long time, livable communities back to the 1950s. It's still here. It's, institutionalized maybe in the US DOT's strategic plan that was released in 2012, but there was this real hype and discussion and obsession almost with livability as a policy issue between 2009 and 2011. And I want us to think critically from each of our perspectives, and I'll tell you what I think, and you're welcome to disagree with me in the question and answer. What did it mean that it just dropped off so quickly, that the buzz kind of just slowed so abruptly? And what does that teach us as academics that we should be doing research on? And what does it teach our policymakers in terms of how to move forward with fundamental change in transportation? And then I think part of that answer is paying a little bit more attention to rural transportation than we have. And Vermont is a rural state. And I gave this seminar at UC Davis. And the students in the Q&A were clearly wanted to see pictures of Vermont. They wanted to know what the land use and transportation patterns of Vermont were. So I have inserted for you some kind of awkward pictures, just the best I have of Vermont. You never take pictures of your home. So we'll insert in there just about the time when you're getting sick of hearing me talk about livability. We'll show some pictures of Vermont cheese and stuff. So livability. What is livability? You tell me. What comes to your mind? Right away. Shout it out. Oh, I'll repeat it when you shout it. No problem. What's livability? Healthy, active, walkable communities. What else? Choices. What else? Clean air. Safe. Affordable. Good. He's cheating. So much like you probably felt when I asked that, we kind of all know what livability is, but we're not really sure how to define it. And I sort of faced that dilemma that I didn't exactly know how to find it in kind of a weird way. There was a UTC Spotlight Conference in 2010, and in 2009, in part, I think, because Rob went for a job at the US DOT, they needed somebody to chair the conference. And I was a UTC director in Vermont, and they asked me to do that. And I got a phone call from the TRB staff person, Tom Pomerley, a fantastic guy, who said, we've got this task force put together, Lisa. It was a fabulous list of names. Would you like to chair it and plan a conference on transportation systems for livable communities? And I thought, oh, gosh, of course I want to do that. I've been a long-time believer in transportation systems and livability, believing that transportation and quality of life were incredibly linked. I thought I knew what livability was, and I said, yes, I would love to chair that task force. And in part, the UTC I had gone to Vermont to found. I took the job because they were going to establish a brand new transportation program, basically from no transportation program at all. And the theme was going to be sustainability, mobility, and livability. We had these signature projects with interdisciplinary teams, and we were working on these very livability things and doing it in a rural state, just as an aside. And livability wasn't a new concept. In 1950s, Lewis Mumford and others were using the word livability to criticize the way highways were being built in our cities, much the same way that the people of Burlington, Vermont and Portland, Oregon would probably criticize highway building in the 21st century. There was the relatively famous book, Livable Streets, was the 1980s. And then actually, if you look through the 1990s at things like the Transit Cooperative Research Program, the word livability shows up in all sorts of transit-related reports. So it's not like this was a new thing. And I really believed, as the chair of that task force, this is mom and apple pie. This is what transportation systems are about. Finally, we're going to go there in a big way. When we started having our meetings as a task force, which was January 2010, we realized that we didn't really know what livability was, that we actually couldn't write it down. This is a task force of government agencies, private sector, academics, and we very quickly realized that, well, we weren't defining livability, and we weren't defining livable communities. We needed to focus on transportation systems for livable communities, and that was a little different. And so the textbook example of that is sort of that we as transportation professionals might ensure safe routes to school. But good schools are part of livable communities, and that's not part of our job, the good teachers, the good facilities. So it's almost like transportation is a means to an end. It's a necessary but not sufficient system for ensuring livable communities. And this was muddying the waters of our so-called easy conference. I thought it was going to be so easy to work with the great people and plan this conference. So this is the definition that we came up with and used for the conference. It's a lot like many of the definitions that are accepted. It was received well by the conference attendees. Systems that work with land use to give everyone multiple travel choices for meeting their daily mobility needs affordably, safely, conveniently, efficiently. The very words that you guys were able to shout out at the beginning of this seminar. In the time since that conference in 2010 and my discussions with livability, I have actually decided that choices is the wrong word, that it's the wrong metric for truly comprehensive livability. And I've changed my personal definition of transportation systems for livable communities to be about how reliable or robust those systems are, your accessibility to things. And I think that's a lot different than choices. I think choices is a simplified metric. It's an urban metric. And probably robustness is the topic for another seminar. So let's go back to that buzz, the hype, 2009, 2011. Where did it come from? So you may recall that August 2005 was Safe TLU. That was the federal transportation legislation that, among other things, created national UTCs at PSU and the University of Vermont. And that's how we all know each other, I suppose. It was also the transportation bill that kind of they knew as they went into it that there was going to be a transportation funding crisis in the middle of that era. And they knew they were going to need to change federal transportation policy, in part because of that funding crisis that was sort of looming on the horizon. And so we had, following 2005, a lot of commissions and summits discussing transportation and the future of transportation. And the first time we see quality of life and livability sort of appear in this modern era, if you will, was at a summit of industry, private, public sector thought leaders in March 2007. And the phrase quality of life is all over the transcript from that summit. So in other words, in reinventing federal transportation policy, we need to pay attention to quality of life. That's the piece that we haven't been measuring. That's the outcome we should be really striving for. So why can't we do that explicitly? Same with the Revenue Study Commission, Transportation for Tomorrow. It was released in December 2007. Maybe you've used it in classes here. We've used it in some of our transportation graduate classes at Vermont. And it really lays out the landscape for transportation and federal transportation policy. And all through that, they talk about we should be explicitly pursuing transportation systems that build quality of life. That's what we should be doing. And so all of this was before the Obama administration. Obama was elected in November 2008. And then in January 2009, U.S. DOT Secretary Ray LaHood was confirmed and became the DOT's leader. And in his confirmation hearings, he was talking about livability. And so, it was quite prominent. It wasn't hidden in a footnote. It was quite prominent. And it was very clear, if you look at what he was saying, that the leaders of the U.S. DOT, the leaders of the administration, were thinking about a fundamental restructuring of the federal transportation program. That's kind of what they meant by livability. And I think, to be fair to them, there was a lot of criticism hurled at them in that 2009-2011 period. Some of it about rural versus urban, some of it about top-down versus bottom-up. Right in January 2009, they were talking about bottom-up. They were talking about community-led and the feds supporting that. And they were also equally talking about rural and urban. So it wasn't an afterthought to add some of that stuff. But even at that point, in the winter 2009, AASHTO and certain members of Congressional Congress were criticizing, were warning that livability was a bad thing. This is a diversion of funds from highways to transit. It's a diversion of funds from rural to urban. And so right away, people were on it and objecting to it. So by July 2009, did we miss one? Yes. Here's a 3, sorry. May 2009 is when you first start seeing Congressman Oberstar, who's chair of the House Committee, presenting ideas for a completely new transportation policy embedded in a new transportation bill. The House Democrats are really pushing for that with the White House, and we've got the U.S. DOT sort of building institutional pieces, a partnership with EPA and HUD, releasing livability principles. And so the sort of, on both sides, the political and in the U.S. DOT, things are moving forward very, very quickly. Okay, so people are already starting to talk about livability. It's sort of at its hype, or the hype is starting. But then already in the summer of 2009, the funding problem starts with the Highway Trust Fund. And so we have this little bit of a tug-of-war over, are we going to reinvent the transportation bill and the federal transportation policy, or do we need to first move and do something about the fact that the trust fund is makeup, that we need money? And we start seeing talks about extending safety lieu. And as you know now, they extended safety lieu several times. And ultimately, filling the funding gap got taken care of first, ahead of reinventing the transportation system in maybe the way the U.S. DOT leaders and Congressman Oberstar, who'd long been a champion of transportation and livability, might have imagined we should do. But it was after all this happened that I got the phone call saying the UTCs are going to have a conference and it's going to be on livability. Would you like to chair this dream task force of people? And I hadn't really been paying attention to the details of livability other than being excited myself that it was being talked about, that President Obama was talking about transportation in important speeches. And so we started meeting as a task force in January, struggling with definition, realizing we didn't know what the definition was, that nobody really had an exact one. And by April 2010, AASHTO had released a document, same time the FHWA is releasing guidelines. AASHTO basically releases a document called The Road to Livability, in which they document in glossy colors all the wonderful things that state DOTs have been doing all along. State DOTs are the leaders in livability based on reading this publication. And of course, you can imagine the undercurrent of what that battle is really about. Is change needed? Is change not needed? Have we been doing livability all along? In June 2010, the summer of 2010, the hype was absolutely at its highest. That's when all kinds of state DOT employees were wondering what livability was. People were thinking, oh, the next transportation bill is going to be based on livability. I got to go to the TRB Executive Committee and observe them debate the issue, and you could see the tug-of-war going on there, and the tug-of-war between urban and rural starting. So in 2010, we had our conference. It was oversubscribed because of the hype, and I actually think some of you, or actually the graduate students before you from PSU, came to the conference with Jennifer. Rob was there. Oversubscribed because people were trying to figure out what livability was. There was such a hype about it, and they wanted to know. And so we were really blessed in that way. Measurement was seen as a concern. People liked our definition. And state DOTs were really seen as the barriers by the participants of the conference. And in January 2011, livability is part of the TRB annual meeting theme. And then if you see on the right-hand side of this slide, by January 2012, putting people to work was the TRB annual meeting theme. And I think that's what happened in 2011 in federal transportation policy. We went from we should be building for livability to let's put people to work. And that's not a transportation policy, that's an economic policy. So you have to question our ability to really be effective with federal transportation policy. The FHWA and the US DOT was still doing their part through 2011, hosting workshops, using livability as a criteria in their programs. And so I think all of that was good. But what really I maybe sealed the fate, if you will, of the incredible push for livability was the Tea Party arriving in the House in the fall of 2011, and the champion of transportation and livability really on the House committee, Congressman Oberstar, was defeated in Minnesota. And that was an important loss of a leader for what the new transportation bill was going to look like. So I used to, a few months ago, talk like, livability, the buzzword, is dead. And then people would get defensive and say, but livability isn't dead. We've done so many great things. Look, it's one of the 5 goals in the US DOT strategic plan. And I think that's true. I think livability is not dead. It hasn't been dead. It's been, push for this for 60 years. And the administration got it into the strategic plan, and that's really great. What I want us to think about is, why did the buzzword go away? And why didn't the push continue at the high energetic level it was at in 2010? So I have 5 hypotheses for you to think about. Why did that push slow? Why did the buzzword go away? And so you have to be fair. Give a moment to think about, well, maybe it's because livability was not a worthy idea. Maybe transportation policy change wasn't needed at the federal level. And realistically, you have to reject that hypothesis. Livability had credence. I mean, people have been pushing for this since 1950. And so greenhouse gases, congestion, the financial mess, everything is saying we need a complete overhaul of the system. So it's certainly not that it was a bad policy idea. It was a very good policy idea, in my opinion. A lot of people raised the issue that the institutional structures for livability were not in place, and that is why the push had to slow. That's why the buzz went away. That's why we don't see livability featured prominently in MAP 21. I think there's something to discuss there, right? I mean, livability is a local thing. We're talking about federal policy. Livability involves more than transportation. There's all sorts of interagency horizontal cooperation issues. There's certainly challenges there. Undoubtedly, these things are true. But I think overall we have to reject the hypothesis. And the reason for that is that there are other buzzwords, other pushes in society, like sustainability or even context-sensitive solutions in transportation, where we didn't have institutional structures for them, but they lived lives that were decades long. And so I don't think the lack of institutions is a reason why we had that dropping off of livability. Still, another group of people say that livability was unmeasurable, and ultimately we can't do things that are unmeasurable. We didn't have the data, so we can't pursue it. I just completely disagree with this, and this was the topic that we spent most of the time at the UTC conference talking about, was data and performance measures. And people would always talk about the data and the performance measures, having weaknesses, not being perfect. They're all not perfect. I mean, we don't even really know how many miles people travel. We don't even really know what the vehicle fleet is in America, but we move forward anyway with things like air quality policies. So just because there were no performance metrics, I think that that's not a reason for stuff for a push to not be there. That's a reason to make the performance measures we do have better. And in fact, some of the documents I have from the USDOT in 2009, which I can't figure out whether they're public or not, are really good documents about livability performance metrics. So I completely reject that. I don't think that a policy push dies because it's unmeasurable. I think it is measurable. So listening to the timeline I told you about, you might agree with hypothesis 4. Other issues in America came up. The Highway Trust Fund was bankrupt. There was an unemployment crisis. We had to put people back to work. And it diverted attention from a complete reinvention of how we do transportation. And undoubtedly those things are true. And that was a reason why the push leveled off, the buzzword disappeared. You can't deny that. But you do have to pause for a minute and think about what an opportunity lost that was. Because a different, not just business as usual response from the transportation system might have gotten us the change that transportation engineers and planners have been seeking for decades. But we didn't do it. Instead, we used transportation as a way to help the economy and to create jobs in the same way that we had always been doing it. Maybe with the changes in the Tiger Grant criteria were certainly a move forward, but not the dramatic move forward that I think we would all hope for. And I don't think the USDOT leadership was hoping for that incremental change. I think they were hoping for dramatic change. And that's still going on now. I mean, the State of the Union of this year was not as exciting for transportation professionals as the State of the Union 3 or 4 years ago. It's back to fix it first. It's back to highways. And it's back to focusing on putting people to work instead of focusing on accessibility, quality of life, livability. But I go one step further with hypothesis 5. I think that it would have been easier, even with an economic crisis in America, to move transportation and livability further forward, further than the successes we had, if it hadn't been so bloody vague and ill-defined. It was the wrong word. I think the intention and the vision was good but incomplete, but it was ultimately the wrong word. And so we've done a little bit of research at Vermont that illustrates that. We've did numerous surveys with our UTC money, and we asked about quality of life and accessibility. And there's no relationship between accessibility and the quality of life people have. And this was just shocking to me with the beliefs I've always had about livable communities and transportation. Some of the most isolated people were the happiest people with their life, which maybe gets to some of the self-selection things that you folks are studying in your theses. We also did some work with some AARP data sets for people 55 and over, I think, and asking them what was important about their community. And you know, they don't say sidewalks, they don't say bike paths, they don't say transportation systems, they don't say buses, they don't say these things. So I'm not sure that good transportation systems are really well explained with the word livability. And that was, you know, hindsight. Further, I think that well-meaning people, including the UTC director from rural Vermont, gravitated to urban examples to try and explain what livability was. Okay, well-meaning people. Destinations close to home. Man, if you live in rural Vermont, that doesn't include you. It just doesn't. I'm sure it doesn't if you live in rural Oregon either. Livability means being able to take your kids to school, go to work, see a doctor, drop by the grocery or post office, go out to dinner or a movie, and play with your kids in a park, all without having to get in your car. If you live in small-town America, even if they're saying, no, we want to make the cities more like your walkable village, there's no destinations in that rural village anymore. This excludes you. And so I think when all of us, including the rural UTC directors, gravitated to urban examples, we were kind of digging ourselves in deeper in creating that division between rural and urban America. So ultimately, I think that the rural states, the DOTs, AASHTO, the congressional delegations, they just couldn't get behind a reinvention, even if there hadn't been an economic crisis and an unemployment crisis. They couldn't get behind something that was somewhat of a risk. Is this going to include us? Do they know what they're going to fund in rural America? What's the vision for transportation in rural America in the 21st century? Does anybody actually have a vision? And even though within the programs like Tiger, things were being funded in all types of communities in America, this is too scary, a reinvention of federal transportation policy for rural leaders to get behind. It's just too much of a risk. So it's an old lesson that we learn, I think, from the buzzword dying. The buzzword, not the concepts, the buzzword, that context matters. Federal transportation policy, if only because there's 2 senators from every state, has to have a vision for both rural and urban America, or I don't think it's ever going to get reinvented at the federal level. Now, I spent a sabbatical in California. In California, they don't care about federal transportation policy very much. They have the means to really have California transportation funding, California transportation vision and programs. We don't have that in rural Vermont. We're very concerned about what the federal transportation policy would be. So are buzzwords valuable? Yes, absolutely. I think buzzwords get people having the debate. And I agree with the people who say if there's no debate and you're pushing for someone that something that everybody supports, you're probably pushing for the wrong thing, right? And the livability buzz was a very important one, very valuable. Important things got a good boost. I think the most impressive is that it's there as one of the 5 goals in these USDOT strategic plan. But I don't know Ray LaHood. I don't think if you asked Ray LaHood if the livability policy effort was successful that he would say yes. I think that he and his leaders, hoping for more holistic change. I think that they wanted to see the concepts they meant by the bad choice of word livability to be implemented in the next transportation bill, which turned out to be MAP 21. That change has been called for since the 1950s. I think they knew they had a good push behind them. And that also means that this push is going to come again. We need to keep trying. That's why we study transportation, right? We know it's a flawed system nationwide. We want to change it. And so now we need to say to ourselves, well, what should we do differently? What should we learn from this livability phase? And how do we make it comprehensive and more inclusive? And so I have some ideas about that I'll share. If you think about livability, when I said right at the beginning of the lecture, what is livability? I mean, not just people who go to PSU and live in Portland think about Portland. Lots of people think about Portland, right? And we think about urban solutions. We have that gravitation towards the urban. And I think it's because we have a vision for the urban, but we really haven't got a clue what to do with rural transportation systems in America. We just don't have a vision. And so we know in urban areas that we need to design demand instead of responding to it, connect land use, road pricing, EVs, car sharing, multiple modes, active transportation. I gave this seminar somewhere and people argued with me about whether or not those were the right things to do in urban areas. And I think that's great. It's great that we have a list of things in the urban areas that we can actually debate. We don't have anything like that for rural America. You're not going to pick up Portland's transportation system and plunk it down in Vermont and have it work. It's completely unviable. And the DOTs are small. They're strapped for resources. They are just holding the system together with duct tape in a small state like Vermont. They don't have spare time to envision a really creative, changed 21st century transportation system for Vermont. And even when they do, there's so many barriers, things that simply don't work. I think Vermont falls into a special category of rural state, because certainly you have way more rural area in Oregon than we have in all of Vermont, in that it's a state without a major metropolitan area, which means the funding mechanisms available to us are really, really limited. You may have heard this week we added a 6-cent gas tax in Vermont. We did congestion pricing, all the creative finance schemes, public-private partnerships. We're not going to do that in rural America. That's not really going to happen. So I think a place like Minnesota, you can potentially do revenue generation in Minneapolis and use it to connect the rural areas. But there's a subset of states, about half of the ones we label as rural, that don't have that major metropolitan area. So here's the part where you're tired of hearing my philosophies on stuff, and you get a couple of pictures of Vermont. There it is, way over there, south of Montreal. I live in northern Vermont. It's 5 hours north of Wall Street, basically, driving straight up the Hudson River, basically, and then crossing over Lake Champlain. You see that we're kind of light green, but so our mountains are not as big as your mountains, but it is a really rolling mountainous state. We have a lot of snow. That's not a misperception. It certainly affects our transportation system. It affects our operating budgets, affects our maintenance budgets. We've got to do all the winter maintenance involved in that. We do make maple syrup in those forests, like you might suspect. And we have a lot of covered bridges, which you may associate with Vermont and New Hampshire. And actually, VTrans is sort of one of the national leaders in historic preservation. It's something they've done a particularly good job with. We do make a lot of great cheese, although I will give you that you guys make good cheese here too. This happens to be the presidents and vice presidents of UVM in their hairnets touring our cheese cave in rural Vermont. And we do fly some of that cheese, some, not much of it, out of the state. But for the most part, it doesn't go much further than Boston. It's not viable. The reverse haul in the empty truck is a transportation issue for those small artisanal cheese folks. We have a really cool bike ferry. I can't really compete with all your bicycle infrastructure, but I'm not sure you have a bike ferry. This is Lake Champlain. There's a causeway that's about 2.5 miles in total, I think. There's a gap in it where there used to be a rail lift bridge. And Local Motion, our advocacy organization, runs a bike ferry. It attracts lots of tourists. You can see the Adirondacks would be on this side. And that's me biking to Montreal. So Vermont is a very different place. Context matters, and it's going to matter to livability. And if we have to abandon the word livability and redefine federal transportation policy, it's going to matter to the new buzzword as well. So I'm on sabbatical in California, so I thought it was valuable to kind of keep the numbers up here for California, sort of put Oregon in context. 626,000 people is not a lot of people to try to do anything with on a statewide level. The economy, the GDP is very small. You can see that it's a very tiny state, but when we look at highway miles and miles per person, there's by far more for each of us in Vermont to sort of take care of than there is for you or certainly for those folks in California. The rural landscape is different. I used to have this ongoing debate with Guy from Montana that rural wasn't different in the West and the East, and if David Kack is listening out there, I now admit that Western rural is different. This is a piece of Vermont. When you do research on accessibility and livability in rural areas, you can't use census blocks, you can't use zip codes, you can't do any of the regular GIS stuff that you might do in your classes or your research. Because basically these areas are huge, and when you average out the population in them, it kind of looks like they're doing okay. But we also don't have any of those giant, vast, empty rural areas that you have with incredibly few people. We just have this rolling hill, 4,000 feet is about our tallest mountain, completely covered development. These are E911 points of the buildings in Vermont, and that's how we do a lot of our accessibility research, is we actually use the point coverage of the buildings. So if you can get your state to release that data, you might enjoy using it here as well. And what we were looking at was trying to figure out, well, where are the hubs in Vermont that we could connect with a cross-state transit system? What areas are truly transit serviceable? And that, you just couldn't do that on a census block basis. And so you see that we actually have quite a few of those. But there's also just people in between in every one of those little New England towns. And so it becomes really hard to serve those people. We do have several good intercity commuter bus lines. We have some transit basically everywhere in the state, but they struggle to be viable, as transit agencies do everywhere. And of course, it's the more populated Burlington area where the transit is most viable. But the difference really comes back to this issue of major metropolitan area. These are our census urban clusters. The largest one is the third row there, 38,000 people. So it's just really hard to know how to provide livability that we as academics conceive of for Portland and know what to do with these communities and how to connect them. We don't know what the transportation solution is going to be. This is the biggest of those. It is the tallest building's 11 stories. That's Lake Champlain. So the options here are better, but not as good as someplace the size of Portland. We do have some advantages in our landscape in that we don't have sprawling development along most of our interstates. There's basically one interchange in all of Vermont that has suburban sprawl development on it. There's a couple of things at play there. There's no growth in rural areas for the most part. So you need growth to change your built environment. And we don't ever think about that. We sort of study our planning and transportation classes, and we think about how we're going to build the new stuff differently. People in rural states aren't going to build anything new. So there's going to be you've got to work with what you've got. And to their credit, in Vermont, in 1970, in response to the interstate, there was quite a landmark piece of state legislation basically requiring an incredible environmental review for any even sort of smallish development at all. And it really meant that we didn't get the sprawling development that happened along interstates in many other states. So what we have in Vermont is some really, really strong village centers. So one might say we have livability if you define it as being able to go to a downtown and walk. If you define it as accessibility to the services you need, I'm not sure the people in some of those strong downtowns would necessarily say they have it. And I really can't talk about Vermont or show you pictures about Vermont without throwing in a Tropical Storm Irene series of pictures. So in a state like Vermont that's this small, we struggle to make the cost share on our federal transportation money. That's all we're doing, really, is raising enough money in our state T fund to match that federal money so we can draw it down and even use it. We don't really have any fat to respond to any crises. And in 2011, there was that first hurricane was going to hit New York City, and it hit Vermont instead as a tropical storm. And it basically did this to, I had to write this down because I cannot even fathom it. It was 2,400 road sections in Vermont were closed. Okay, really tiny state, right? Well over 100 bridges, okay, on the local and state system. And so then this becomes, and actually I have to say VTrans was absolutely unbelievable the way they put all their people out throughout the state, pulled everything together. There were places where in the first few days they were delivering food by horse and stuff. Not VTrans, but other folks. And they got these roads back together. But that's the sort of respond to the crises situation that I think rural America is in. So this is my list of rural transportation problems. There are miles and miles of roads per person falling apart. We are talking about strategic disinvestment of roads just because we have to in rural America. We don't have really any options for revenue. Especially in Oregon, you might say, VMT tax, Lisa. Why can't you do a VMT tax? Well, even our very progressive senator, Bernie Sanders, is wary of VMT tax because it's regressive for these poor people in rural areas who have no other choices. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place on even revenue. So there's longer distances, so everything's going to be more expensive. Energy costs are going to hit us harder. Traditional transit is just not. It's not feasible. It's not going to work. Biking and walking, really limited potential. The people you're dealing with are older and poorer in general. Growth is slow, so we can't reinvent the land use. It just goes on and on. You might say, ha-ha, Lisa, electric vehicles. Hydro-Quebec is powering Vermont. You've got clean electricity. Why don't you put all those people on electric vehicles? And then you talk to the electrical engineers at the University of Vermont, and you realize that the electric grid, the weakest spots are in the rural areas. The transformers and the hardware out there is not really going to be able to easily carry the additional load that plugging all the rural electric vehicles in might add to those loops. So this is kind of a depressing seminar now that I think about it. On top of it, the telecommunications are really weak. So where we might hope to use the internet to keep older citizens connected, to maybe allow them to see healthcare providers without travel, they don't have broadband. They have dial-up in lots of rural America. That's not just a Vermont thing. So the options are really, really limited. So think about being a senator from Vermont and Ray LaHood it is so exciting. We have a president and a U.S. DOT secretary talking about reinventing the transportation system. But they pick this word, livability, that flashes urban images in everyone's head. Can you sort of face these problems and think, okay, I can trust that that reinvention will serve us okay? I just don't think you really can. You need to see a comprehensive vision. And so what do I think we need next? Where do we go from livability? We need a new word. I think livability is tainted. I don't think we can get it back with the rural leaders. I think that we need to envision a comprehensive and sellable future for rural America, and probably that they're going to turn to us in academia to do that. We need some performance metrics. We need further work on that, no doubt. I think we need to scratch choices, move to robust and reliable. I think we need to make room for the private sector in transportation in America. That's a complete other lecture, but we have some silly rules, silly bylaws that prevent the private sector from really serving mobility needs. And then we need fundamental institutional change, that we've set up these institutions, giant institutions. We funded those institutions to build interstate highways. We need to do the fundamental change. It's going to be so, so very hard to really get to that next generation transportation system. So I think that there's just jumps right out at me, things that we should be doing in academia. We should be working on the performance metrics, and we should be not just doing the really cool urban research. I mean, I myself, that's what I've done mostly. It's really fantastic to talk about designing transportation systems in cities and communities. That's where there are people. But could we, if we all put our brains together, envision an equally good solution for the rural landscape? And I've got to believe that we actually could. Those of you who know me in the audience know that I normally do surveys. I collect data and I report tables. This is not that sort of seminar. It's an ideas seminar. It doesn't have numbers to back it up. It's a world I'm pretty uncomfortable in, and I had so many people help me sort through my thoughts. These are not people who necessarily agree with me, but they are people whose ideas I really appreciated being shared with me. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Well, we have some time for some questions.
So I'm going to push back a little bit to challenge you. 80% of the U.S. population lives in urban areas, and that's going up. That's where the growth is. That's where the new economy is. That's what's going to drive this country in the future. I could make an argument that we've overinvested in the past in rural transportation, and we've underinvested in urban, and that the current structure of transportation is inappropriately dominated by state DOTs at the expense of metropolitan areas. And so maybe that why should we care about the rural? And I think the reason we do is that the current structure forces us to, but
Right.
Is that right?
So there's not a word you said that I don't completely disagree with, or don't completely agree with, sorry. You know, I absolutely agree with everything Jennifer said, but there's a few things. the first thing is that the reality of the Congress makes it so we have to. And the fact that we've been investing all that money and not really investing it well for accessibility and mobility means that actually the change is more needed in the rural areas. We have to invest in the rural areas anyway for the freight system and for the food system. So I think that that always strengthens why you need good, solid rural transportation to support urban areas. And then finally, the other reason that we often use at the TRC is that people come to these large trip generators that are tourist destinations in the rural areas. And so they use the rural infrastructure, but they don't really have a vested interest in it and don't particularly contribute to its upkeep. So there's kind of a whole set of inequities in how we collect revenue for and then invest in transportation as a whole, but also the rural system. And I think that, I guess I've got to believe that it wouldn't necessarily be more money than we're currently spending in rural transportation. It just needs to be different types of investments because the current system is just not going to serve the future needs.
Jeannie, this is getting good.
So, you know, in 2011, a few things happened that you didn't mention. In addition to me leaving the DOT, the run-up to the election really began. And so I think the whole set of priorities, the whole amount of time that the DOT could get from the White House totally changed. And I think you also maybe intentionally or unintentionally kind of left out two things. That the Tiger program was instituted as part of the stimulus package, and it very specifically included jobs, economic competitiveness, and livability. So there were three criteria in that. We didn't have the ability, we still don't really, to do performance measurement very well in those three areas. So I think it has informed and established a real strong research need. But the other thing that you left out is that the Secretary never talked about one of his 5 priorities in isolation. And so I think if you look at the whole package, one of the reasons why I was inspired to go work there was that it was safety, livability, sustainability, economic competitiveness, and state of good repair. And to me, the importance of each of those 5 is going to change a little bit depending on who you are and where you are. In a rural area, of course, state of good repair and safety and economic competitiveness are all the things that you were talking about. And so, yeah, I mean, you sort of push one down and the other ones are going to pop up. So I think it might be fruitful to discuss, you know, how they all fit together, which I think is really maybe even more interesting than looking at them separately.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. There's 2 sort of responses that aren't direct answers that I want to make. The first is that I think the Tiger Grant program, and when I say generic program, I mean, obviously that's the top one on my list. It's a great system and it's an improvement over what we're doing, but the fact that in a rural area we struggle for the cost share doesn't actually mean that we can pursue those funds with the same vigor and the same imagination as other places. And so I think those competitive programs, the lack of ability to raise the cost share and to raise local share becomes an issue. And secondly, I've been very intrigued by people who've been talking about sustainability and livability. And in other fields other than transportation, social justice and equity and quality of life and happiness are part of sustainability. They're one of the 3 legs of the stool. And so some people are suggesting, and I think they probably have a potential point, is that in some ways we needed livability or whatever buzzword in transportation because we were so solely focused on the environmental impact piece of sustainability, that if we had done sustainability more comprehensively and saw that social side instead of really, you could say, the engineering side, then maybe we wouldn't have set up this questionable livability label to push.
I have a quick question for you. So just in the same theme, I mean, how much do you think the rural transportation system needs reinventing, or we just need a new budget model for it? I mean, you mentioned there's not a lot of growth and there's a lot of effort to preserve and maintain what you've got. So is it really that it isn't really broken, it just needs to be fixed, or that we need to think about reinventing rural transportation?
I think we need to think about reinventing it. I think we need to do more of the critical thinking on things like ride sharing and smart park and rides and smart ride sharing, and then we need to do especially more in terms of making dynamic demand responsive transit really more effective than it currently is. So, yes, you can get to the doctor from rural wherever, but that's not, so maybe that's a choice. But if you start thinking about the reliability and robustness of that and how it contributes to your quality of life, then it's really, really lacking. And there's also some misfits of vehicles and services and inability to, the whole paid versus volunteer driver in which system. There's talk about, well, why can't senior citizens ride the school buses? I think it's a complete reinvention. I think it's maybe the pieces are there, but we need to completely reinvent how we use them. And I think there's a role for a different type of vehicle as well, a smaller, cheaper vehicle.
Great.
So just to clarify, it is broken, the rural system?
It's pretty broken.
Okay. And then my question was, you may have mentioned this, what exactly is the congressional situation, particularly in the Senate? Are there a lot of rural senators?
So because there's 2 senators from each state, it tends to be the majority of them who will unite together on rural issues. We have 2 senators in Vermont. We have 1 representative. And I think there's probably 3 or 4 states that are in that situation. They have a 3-member delegation.
Pretty much every state has a rural senator.
I don't know whether you could think of them that way.
It's not proportional.
Yeah. Like, for example, the senator from Minnesota or representatives from Minnesota often will relate to and side with rural. There's not a rural caucus or anything that I know of. Maybe Rob could tell us. But I think depending on the issue, there's a good 70% that identify with rural because that's where their voting base is. But then I believe when we did a finance study at the UTC looking at how many states were similar to Vermont in the sense that they didn't have a large metropolitan area. I think it was in the teens, maybe about 13. So South Dakota.
West Virginia.
So I think it's interesting that you come from like the one part of this country where urban-rural doesn't necessarily mean Democrat-Republican. So if you have some insights from that context, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned you have a senator who's very concerned about rural issues, but is a very liberal senator as well. So if there's anything that you've learned from the context of Vermont that could maybe enlighten us in our larger political discussions.
Okay, so that's way out of my field of traffic engineering, but I'll answer it anyway. So there's been a strong New York influence in Vermont. So after the Civil War, and this is just my talking on the street corner in Livable, Burlington, Vermont, a lot of casualties of the Civil War, and there was an outflow of population after the Civil War that didn't happen in New Hampshire, and then an inflow of New Yorkers or people from the South, and it made the population base different between New Hampshire and Vermont, and so there is that, on average, political difference. But that being said, it's not unlike what I imagine Oregon would be. I mean, Burlington is the Portland, and we just have more numbers than the traditional folks in the town. So I think that there is that left and right wing debate. It is the only place I've lived. I've only lived there 6 years, spent the 7th in California, where people are openly Democratic. Like you don't mention that you're a Republican at a meeting. So that's a little weird to me that people just assume we're all Democrats here, whereas I've lived in Kentucky, lived in Connecticut, where people had very good, well-thought-out reasons to philosophically be where they are politically. So there is that sort of liberal flavor in Burlington, but that's not true in the rural areas. And everybody has a very strong libertarian bend. So, for example, Vermont doesn't fall the way you think it would fall on gun control. So, you know, every place is unique. Context matters, and matters to livability, among other things. Okay, no more scary questions that far away from transportation engineering.
This is a transportation engineering question. Sorry. Well, you kind of dismissed the hypothesis of performance measures as being a big deal, but you also mentioned that state DOTs were a big factor in resisting this change. And when you say state DOT, I think a bunch of people who are way too concerned about performance measures. And you know, you also mentioned, and I agree with this, that rural transportation is broken. But if you're looking at it specifically from a performance measure, if you're looking at it the way a state highway engineer looks at it, the rural transportation system's great. You know, you have good level of services, you have no traffic congestion, you have people that are getting where they want to with reasonable travel times. I don't know how the highway funds go in terms of whether rural highways are more expensive. I would assume they're more expensive per capita to maintain than urban highways, but is there any way you could quantify why the single occupant vehicle is not working for a rural area, and you know, how would you quantify the improvements?
I think they're all along the lines of the accessibility metrics that academics are playing with, and I think you're right that DOTs do have some metrics that are not doing great in rural areas. There are things like the bridge ratings and the IRI for the pavement ratings. So there's some of that, but unless you're actually measuring what, you know, latent demand and whether or not people are getting where they need to be, you don't see it in the numbers. And we actually tried in our UTC surveys to get at latent demand because we wanted to correlate that with where people lived in the state. And at this point, everybody, most people for the most part, can use their car and they have automobile access. Now, as the population ages, Vermont is one of the older states in the nation, that may become less true. But I think that it was very clear in the interviews and talking to the people that did the interviews for the latent demand that the people on the other end of the phone didn't even know what we were talking about. You know, they don't think of travel as a burden the same way we urbanists do, and so it became very, very hard to measure. So you're right that there is a desperate need for improvements in how state DOTs use measures and a development of measures that can be calculated. I just don't think that that was a reason that livability didn't sort of play a prominent role in MAP 21, because I think the performance metrics that the US DOT had in draft form were really good ones, and they would have worked to get us going. And lots of state DOTs actually in 2010, when they were panicking and thinking that livability might be the next transportation bill, funded studies within their own state about how we would measure livability, and you know, they came up with stuff. So I don't think it was a fatal gap.
Well, I think we're out of time. This is really interesting discussion. So I think we should all thank Dr. Aultman-Hall for this.
Thank you.
Great talk. And we'll see you all next week when our speaker is Hyunsu No from University of Arizona talking about public transportation models.